Hi everyone, it's me, Ben, GNC Centric, and today I'm going to be doing the second reading of Sapphistries, Global History of Love Between Women by Leila J. Rupp. So, last time we read the preface, which is kind of about who helped her and how she got here, the author, to making this book. Then the introduction, which was kind of just explaining some background about like what counts as lesbian historically, different words for it in different countries throughout history. And then chapter 2 in the beginning, a lot of it was just like conjecture of like what could have been, because you don't have recorded history from back then about female homosexuality. And then, which was interesting but also kind of disappointed, because like the whole reason I bought this book was I thought this stuff had like earlier stuff that other books didn't have. But anyway, it's fine. And today we're going to read chapter 3, which is In Ancient Worlds, 3500 BC to 800 CE. If there's anybody in the audience who can tell me if my audio is good or bad, let me know and I'll adjust things. So I get the sense that this chapter is basically Sappho and like the Roman and Greek female homosexuality stuff. One second. Okay. Chapter 3, In Ancient Worlds. If I meet, and suddenly I can't speak, my tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin, seeing nothing. Hearing only my own ears, drumming, I drip with sweat, trembling shakes my body, and I turn paler than dry grass at such times. Death isn't far from me. So wrote Sappho in the 6th century BCE to an unnamed recipient whose enticing laughter makes my own heart beat faster. It certainly sounds like an expression of desire for someone whose voice is a sweet murmur. It is without a doubt, I would argue, an expression of desire for a woman. It is from ancient worlds, from Sappho, that women who love women have gotten our most persistent label. Why did Sappho's legacy have such strong, lasting power? Why does she stand out so strikingly in our history? To attempt to answer those questions, we must turn to evidence that has come down to us from the first civilizations that recorded their histories. By quote-unquote civilizations, I mean the earliest societies that accumulated surplus resources, created state structures, and left some kind of written or artistic record. These societies emerged in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, in Egypt and along the Indus River in northwest India by 3000 BCE, and on the island of Crete, along with Hwanghae or Yellow River in China, in Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization, in the mid-2nd millennium BCE. Between 1000 to 500 BCE, around the Mediterranean and in Asia, the growth of empires and innovation in religion, philosophy, and culture resulted in a rise of what we have come to call classical civilizations. In the earlier civilizations, and even in classical times, written records, not surprisingly, tend to be silent about sexuality in general, much less about female sexuality, much less about female same-sex sexuality. But there is fragmentary evidence, laws, visual representations, and cultural productions, almost entirely from the minds of men, that suggest that love between women was not unknown. The legal codes of Mesopotamia, for example, have some references to male same-sex sexuality, but they say nothing about women having sex with other women. Likewise, the Hebrew Bible does not mention female same-sex sexuality, although it does condemn male same-sex anal intercourse. European missionaries in the 16th century reported that the Mayans allowed sex between young men. In all these cases, women are nowhere to be found. What evidence we do have of female same-sex sexuality is diverse ancient societies is fragmentary. Pottery depicting same-sex sexual acts, including between women from the from the Mochica, 1000 to 800 CE, and the Chimu, 1100s to 1400 CE, civilizations that flourished before the advent of Inca rule in what is now Peru suggests at least knowledge and perhaps acceptance of such relations. The document known as the Florentine Codex, written in Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the Aztecs, shortly after the Spanish conquest, suggests that pre-conquest Aztecs study attitudes towards both male and female same-sex sexuality were not as harsh as those of the conquistadors. For both men and women, it is the violation of gender expectations that is noted. She is a woman who has a foreskin and has a penis. She is a possessor of arrows, an owner of darts. She has a manly body. She often speaks in the fashion of a man. She often plays the role of a man. She possesses facial hair. But it is not just gender transgressions that mark the Patlache. She is a possessor of companions, one who pairs off with women. She has sexual relations with women and she makes friends with women. She never wishes to be married. The tone is one of disapproval, but there is no call for punishment. On the other side of the globe, ancient Chinese texts refer to tuishi, eating each other, to denote oral sex between women. A writer in the 2nd century CE, Ying Shao, commented, "When palace ladies act towards each other as man and wife, it is called tuishi. Women married to the same man and living in the same household had the opportunity to have sexual relationships with one another, and such bonds could, in fact, make for harmonious living." An ancient sex handbook described a complicated position in which a man could have sex with two women at the same time, while the women could also enjoy genital contact. The term "mojingzi," rubbing mirrors, described the possibility of tribadism, but in general, ancient Chinese literature paid little attention to same-sex sexual encounters, because what was important was the exchange of essence between man and woman. Women in polygamous households having sex with one another did not really matter as long as they gave their yin essence to the men who kept them. We know a bit more about female same-sex love in ancient India, circa 1500 BCE to the 8th century CE. Medical, grammatical, and religious texts recognize a third sex and acknowledge male, female, and third sex desire as possibilities for anyone, regardless of the construction of their physical bodies. A classic Sanskrit medical text described women having sex when two women erotically aroused, getting pleasure in intercourse, exchanged the shukra, white fluid, a boneless fetus is formed. A commentary noted a condition in which women who, because of her mother was on top during intercourse when she was conceived, although feminine in form, mounts the woman like a man and rubs her own vulva against the other. Another commentary calls to mind the Amazons in describing women who have sex with women as man-hating and breastless. Legal penalties existed for sex between women, but they were less than those for sex between men, and both fines were low, indicating that these were minor offenses. And the famous Kama Sutra, a text written in the 4th century CE and based on earlier erotic writings, describes women engaging in manual stimulation, using dildos, and enjoying oral sex. Sex between women may occur occasionally or be preferred by some, and it may be between equals or between those differentiated by age or status. The text is not judgmental about the possibilities of pleasure. These scattered references indicate that female same-sex sexuality was not unknown in a variety of ancient worlds, but the preponderance of information about love and sex between women comes from the ancient Greek world, so that is where we shall dwell for a moment. We have already seen that the ancient Greeks told stories about goddesses and Amazons living in the distant past, what we call the Bronze Age, 3000 to 1200 BCE. It was not until the archaic period of Greek history, 800 to 500 BCE, that we begin to have written documents, including the poetry of Sappho. What did the ancient Greeks have to say about their own worlds? What can we learn about love between women? The slim evidence comes from 3 different areas of the Greek world: Sparta, Athens, and Lesbos. These societies developed very different social structures and cultures that had a profoundly different impact on women's lives in general, and the possibility of love between women in particular. In the 7th century BCE, Sparta developed a militaristic regime that valued men as warriors and women as the bearers of warriors. Citizen women, freed from traditional women's work by the labor of slaves, and lower class women, kept their bodies physically fit in order to bear healthy children, and sexuality was not rigidly confined to marriage because what was most important was that women bore children. The Spartans lived communally but segregated by sex for the first 3 decades of life. Men lived with their fellow warriors until the age of 30, although they married at 18 and sex between men was common. In fact, when couples married, the brides dressed in men's clothing and cut their hair in the male style, presumably to lessen the unfamiliarity of the experience for the husbands. From the Athenian perspective, and most of what we know about Sparta comes from the hostile Athenians, Spartan women enjoyed incredible freedom. According to Plutarch, the best Spartan women loved girls. Or, a philosopher reported that Spartan women had intercourse with girls in addition as an initiation rite before their marriage. The Spartan male poet Alcman, writing in the 7th century BCE, composed a maiden song, a hymn intended to be sung by unmarried girls that names and praises the girls in the choir. They sing that their leader, an older woman, exhausts me, which one scholar has argued could refer to an emotional and sexual attachment. Athens, in both the archaic and classical periods, 500 to 323 BCE, was an entirely different story. Adult citizen women lived in sex segregated, but unlike Sparta, private rather than communal world, in the women's quarters of their husband's house. Religious festivals offered the main opportunity for citizen women's public participation, although lower class and slave women went out in public in other contexts. Citizen women married young, around 14, to men around 30. Men had access to other men and to prostitutes or slaves for sex. And of course, Athenian culture celebrated homoerotic and sexual relationships between older and younger men. And what about love and sex between women? In contexts where women lived apart from men, as did upper class women in ancient Athens and elsewhere, sexual relations between women may have flourished away from male eyes. Certainly, the latter Orientalist and salacious tales of sex in the harems of the Middle East suggest that, when men stopped to think about it at all, the possibility worried them. A few Athenian vase paintings depict women with dildos and female prostitutes seemingly engaging in sexual acts with one another, but all these tell us for certain is that Athenian men, the creators and probably influent audience for the vase paintings, knew that women could pleasure themselves or one another. See Figure 3 for an example of for one of the existing examples of two women in a sexual pose. Other vase paintings, some on items designed for women by women, show women in domestic scenes, preparing brides for their weddings, singing, dancing, and bathing in ways that suggest homoeroticism. We know nothing at all about love between women from the perspective of women themselves, only from these writings or artistic productions of men. Aristophanes, author of the play Lysistrata, produced in 411 BCE in the midst of the endless war between Athens and Sparta, portrays as lustful the women who agree to try to end the war by staging a sex strike against their husbands. But they never think to turn to one another. Plato, as we have seen, attributing the story of Aristophanes, imagined the origins of women who love and desire women. But the female beings searching for their lost halves are not, in Plato's eyes, the equals of the males being searching for their lost halves, and in his later work, Plato calls on all same-sex love unnatural. A writer in the 3rd century BCE called on Aphrodite to turn against two women who were engaged in not beautiful sexual relations, and an ancient commentator explained that he was accusing them of being tribads, signifying a masculine or hypersexual woman and seemingly suggesting penetration, either by an artificial penis or a naturally enlarged clitoris. What else can we say about the love between women in Athenian society? Lucian of Samosata, writing several centuries after Plato in the 2nd century CE, in his Dialogues of Courtesans, depict two prostitutes, Clonarium and Leanna, talking about Leanna's lover, Megilla, a rich woman from, tellingly enough, Lesbos. Megilla, revealing a shaved head underneath her wig, seduces Leanna after a banquet, showing her that she could satisfy her as well as a man and offering her gifts. Leanna is ashamed because Megilla is frighteningly masculine and loves her unnaturally, like a man. Two things are significant in this depiction: the connection of an aggressive woman with Lesbos with masculinity, and the portrayal of the seduced as a prostitute. Both masculinity and prostitution, as we shall see, have a long history of association with female same sex love. A lyric poem by Anacreon, a lover of boys who was born in about 570 BCE, tells of a girl from Lesbos who, at a banquet, spurns him and instead lusts after another woman, suggesting that the courtesans and dancers who would have attended and been enveloped in the erotic atmosphere of the banquet, where men may have been engaging in sexual acts and respectable citizens would not have been present, may have turned to one another. Again, we see the association of prostitutes with same-sex sexuality, a connection reinforced by the term heteristria, which is related to hetaira, meaning courtesan, was sometimes used to refer to women who had sex with women. Given these sparse depictions, it is with relief that we turn from Athens to Lesbos. Sappho was born in Mytilene on the island of Lesbos around 612 BCE. She was a poet and a singer and seemed to have been the head of a kind of community of or a school for girls who, before they married, learned to sing and play instruments and dance, to become beautiful and graceful and sensual and to love. Sappho's lyrics, like those that begin this chapter, speak of love and desire. Love shook my heart like a wind falling on oaks on a mountain. Once again, limb loosening, love makes me tremble, the bittersweet, irresistible creature. Sappho's relation with girls, about whom she wrote, has led some scholars to see her not as a lover of women, but as a teacher of sensuality, one who prepared girls for marriage. Of course, marriage was the goal for women, even on Lesbos. But in the Greek world, and perhaps especially in the world of Lesbos, known for its passionate sexuality, sexual desire did not confine itself to one sex or another. Athenian comedies used the words lesbiazein and lesbian, meaning to play the lesbian, to refer to all sorts of loose sexual behavior. Women from Lesbos gained their sexual reputation particularly because of their reputed proclivity for heterosexual oral sex. Part of the mystery surrounding Sappho came from the fact that we have only fragments of her songs. Yet, despite attempts in later centuries to deny the erotic elements of Sappho's lyrics, their portrayal of love for women shines through. For example, in her only complete song, preserved for posterity in the hand of a letter writer, Sappho addresses Aphrodite, the goddess of love, asking for help in winning the love of a woman. Aphrodite flies to her rescue, asking who has done her injustice and promising to change the heart of Sappho's beloved. For if indeed she flees, soon will she pursue. And though she receives not your gifts, she will give them. And if she loves not now, soon she will love, against her will. One fragment of Sappho's lyrics take up the question of what is the most beautiful thing on earth. Some people, Sappho tells us, say it is an army of horsemen, but for her it is what one loves. To illustrate, she tells of Helen of Troy, who surpasses all mortals in beauty, but under the influence of Aphrodite left her husband and child and parents out of love for Paris. Here Sappho is negating Homer's tale of Helen being abducted by the Trojan prince Paris. This reminds Sappho of Anactoria, who is not here, her lovely walk and bright sparkle of her face. I would rather look upon than all the Lydian chariots and full armed infantry. Yet another fragmentary song tells of a woman who has left Lesbos and thinks back with desire of Athos. But she, roaming about far and wide, remembers gentle Athos with desire. This and other fragments suggest that erotic relationships may have formed not only between Sappho and young women in her community, but also among her students, although of course we cannot assume that the songs are autobiographical. And finally, a very fragmentary song tells of a woman weeping because she must leave Sappho. In response, Sappho reminds her of the beautiful things that happen to us, including, and these are all the words that have come down to us in this stanza, and on a soft bed, tender, you satisfying your desire. Perhaps Sappho's songs are also about actual sexual encounters. Is it possible that the following fragment is about the clitoris and men's ignorance of its possibilities, as one scholar has argued? Sappho wrote, like the sweet apple that has reddened at the top of a tree, at the tip of the topmost buff, and the apple pickers missed it there, not, not missed so much as could not touch. Could such lines as "the groom who'll enter is as big as Ares" depict the penetration of heterosexual intercourse in comparison to tender and gentle love between women, as in "May you sleep then on some tender girl friend's breasts"? Or more subtly, could it be that the song about the beautiful things that happen to us describe the movement of the body from the head to the neck on down to end in a satisfied desire? From a different translation of the fragments, with many garlands of violets and roses together, and you put around yourself at my side, and flowers wreathed around your soft neck with rising fragrance. And you stroke the oil distilled from royal cherry blossoms, and on tender bedding you reach the end of longing. It is because of the power of Sappho's songs, not to mention her lonely voice in the record of women desiring women in ancient worlds, that she has played such a central part in the story of love between women. Despite all the latter attempts to destroy or reinterpret her work as being addressed to men's instead of women's, or designed to introduce young women to heterosexual love, or describing an anxiety attack rather than desire, Sappho has come down to us as the emblematic lover of women, the model for the possibility of same-sex desire. She had a Hellenistic imitator by the name of Gnosis, who wrote epigrams in the 3rd century BCE, acknowledging Sappho as her model and Aphrodite as her goddess of choice. Although none of Gnosis's surviving words are directly erotic, her connection to Sappho and her praise of desire and love are important because the voices of women are so rare. Nothing is sweeter than desire. All other delights are second. From my mouth I spit even honey. Gnosis says this, whom Aphrodite does not love, knows not her flowers, what roses they are. Was Sappho a lesbian in any sense other than coming from Lesbos? That is a more complicated question. The earliest reference to Sappho as a lover of women comes from papyrus written in the late 2nd or early 3rd century BCE or CE that is based on a lost text about Sappho from the 4th century BCE. She has been she has been accused by some people of being licentious in her lifestyle and a woman lover, the author notes, neither confirming nor denying the accusation. The question is one taken up in Erica Jong's joyous portrayal of Sappho, who suggests some possible answers. Jong, it should be said, catapulted into the world of contemporary literature with her erotic heterosexual romp, Fear of Flying, which gave the world the term zipless fuck to describe the ideal of a sex act so perfect and instantaneous that zippers needed not be unzipped. It is from a kind of contemporary sexual liberation perspective that she writes about the past. Jong's Sappho's Leap takes the skeletal facts about Sappho's life, the body of Greek mythology, and what we know about the Mediterranean world of fashion to fashion a Sappho who falls in love with Alcaeus, an actual male poet from Lesbos, about whom we know little, except that he loved boys and, according to legend, loved Sappho. But Sappho also loves and desires women, including her slave, Praxinoa, who joins the Amazons, Isis, an Egyptian priestess, and the students she teaches the arts and song and love. Sappho bears Alcaeus' child, conceived before she is married off to an old man and separated from the love of her life. Her mother, who married the tyrant ruling Lesbos after the death of Sappho's father, snatches Sappho's daughter, Cleis, setting the bereft mother and lover off on a journey to find both Alcaeus and Cleis. Along the way, she meets Aesop, of fable fame, who falls in love with her. They encounter one mythological creature and place after another until Sappho is finally reunited with both Alcaeus and Cleis. The novel begins and ends with a reimagining of one of the stories that circulated about Sappho, clung to by those who longed to deny her love of women. In this tale, Sappho leaps to her death for love of a handsome ferryman named Phaon. In Jong's retelling, Phaon is a creation of Zeus, who bets Aphrodite that Sappho can be humbled by a mortal man. Feeling abandoned by Aphrodite, not Phaon, Sappho climbs and then slips from the lover's leap, but is pulled out to sea by Alcaeus Praxinoa, out of the sea, by Alcaeus Praxinoa and Aesop. Jong Sappho is not a lover of women or men, but a devotee of Aphrodite and a lover of love and passion. Did I love women or men? Jong has Sappho ask in her prologue, knowing what history would wonder about her. Does love even have a sex? I doubt it. If you are lucky enough to love, who cares what decorative flesh your lover sports? The divine delta, that juicy fig, the powerful phallus, the scepter of state, each is only an aspect of Aphrodite after all. We are all hermaphrodites at heart, aren't we? So Jong makes of Sappho a lesbian woman in the sense of her artistry, her sexual freedom, and her birth on the island of Lesbos. And Jong's imagining of Alcaeus, a man who was the love of Sappho's life, does not undermine the notion of Sappho as the voice of the lover of women. Jong presents both Sappho and her goddess and patron Aphrodite as feminists of a sort, championing the strength and independence of women. And she represents the changes on Lesbos as a precursor of what was to come. The cost of the long wars is that the people of Lesbos no longer want songs of love but desire patriotic tales of victory in war, and Sappho's lyrics fall out of fashion and her love of girls becomes suspicious. What Jong is suggesting fits, ironically, with the visions of Elizabeth Goulda Davis and Susan Cavan. When war overtakes human society, women are devalued and love between women becomes anathema. Yet there is fragmentary evidence about Sparta, a warlike society that valued women as mothers of warriors. In any case, the prophetic end of Sappho's leap leads us into the Roman world, where we find further evidence of knowledge about the possibilities of love between women, but no Roman Sappho. With the development of the Roman Republic 509 to 27 BCE and the rise of the empire from 27 BCE, Roman women had more access to public life than Athenian women had, but they remained, at least in theory, firmly under the control of men. And men found the idea of sex between women, despite their own interest in sex with other men, a frightening and monstrous thought. Although Sappho's songs were much admired by ancient Roman authors, these writers increasingly seemed obsessed with and disapproving of her lyrics that celebrated love between women. Some insisted that there must have been two Sapphos, one the poet and the other a prostitute. A history in the 3rd or 4th century BCE claimed that it was the prostitute who fell in love with Phaon. Ovid, 1st century BCE to 1st century CE, embroidered the tale in his Letter of Sappho to Phaon, which has had a lasting effect through the centuries. Yet Jong was not the first to retell Sappho's leap into the sea, as we shall see. The references to love between women in Latin literature consider it unnatural and represent women who have sex with women as masculine. The earliest the earliest example comes from a comedy written in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, in which a female slave forces sex on her mistress, a courtesan. Seneca the Elder, circa 55 BCE to 40 CE, wrote of a man who killed his wife when he found her in bed with another woman making use of a dildo. Ovid told the story of a Cretan girl named Iphis, who was raised as a boy and fell in love with the girl she was supposed to marry. She bemoans the fate of loving so unnaturally, but is saved by Isis, who turns her into a boy. Phaedrus, a poet who lived in the 1st century CE, attributed the origin of the tribads to a mistake of Prometheus, who, in a drunken state, slapped male genitals on women. Also writing in the 1st century CE, Martial described a woman as tribas, singular of tribads, of the very tribads, since they engaged in masculine pursuits and devours girls' middles. He also told of a story of the story of admiring the chastity of a woman named Bassa until he found out that she avoided men, but that her monstrous lust imitates a man. Clearly, the Romans knew of the possibility of sex between women. The Roman attitudes that consist was consistent with the views of other people in their Mediterranean world, including the Jews. One Jewish source, written in Greek, commands women not to imitate the sexual role of men. A rabbinical commentary associates marriage between two women with Egyptian or Canaanite practices, an early example of blaming sexual deviance on foreign influence. For the rabbi, female same sex sexuality stemmed from idolatry, harking back to the association between goddess worship and love between women. Later Jewish texts refer to women rubbing with one another and the debate whether that constitutes harlotry. Despite disagreement about the seriousness of the matter, the evidence makes clear that female same sex sexuality was not unknown, even if it was viewed with distaste or worse. Why this distaste? Were Roman and Jewish, and later Christian authors, in fact, responding to unsettling practices? Is there any evidence that women in this world really did fall in love with other women? That is the question posed by Bernadette Brooten, who has written a groundbreaking and controversial book about the female homoeroticism in the world in which Christianity was born. She argues, based on thorough analysis of a wide range of ancient sources, that disgust with women's love for other women was widespread in a reaction to knowledge, however downplayed, that such love existed. She has uncovered a wide range of ancient sources that add to what we already know about the basis of elite literature alone. We already knew on the basis of elite literature alone. What is controversial about Bruton's book is her perspective, for although she insists on the need to analyze ancient sources in the context of the worlds that created them, she at the same time sees the women who emerge from those sources as ancient lesbians. One of the fiercest debates in literature on Greek and Roman same-sex sexuality centers on whether those societies had a category and concept people who engaged in same-sex acts. The most famous proponent of the idea that they did, and that they were recognizable gay people, was John Boswell, author of Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. Bruton's argument is much more nuanced and no less erudite than Boswell's, but critics have nonetheless read her work as suggesting inappropriate elements of trans-historical affinity. Yet, it is possible to separate the notion of ancient lesbians from the evidence that she contextualizes so well. One entracing, pun intended, source from Bruton is erotic spells that one woman commissioned to make another woman love her. Following the pattern of heterosexual spells, these entreaties, perhaps prepared by a professional, laid out the hopes of the client that a desired other will fall in love with her. A few surviving papyrus fragments and lead tablets from Upper Egypt specifying the names of both parties and so identifiable as same-sex spells call on the deities to inflame the heart, the liver, and the spirit of another woman with love and affection, calling on the beloved to love her with passion, longing, and unceasing love. Although the spells are formulaic and cannot tell us anything much about the parties involved, they do represent a rare opportunity to listen to the voices, however filtered by the professionals who prepared the spells, of women who desired women. And they indicate that such women were willing to proclaim their desire for another woman, if not in public, then at least to another person. Imagine the passion that would lead Sophia to commission this spell, with its images of violence, as to snare Gorgonia. Constrain Gorgonia, who Nilogenia bore, to cast herself into the bathhouse for the sake of Sophia, whom Isara bore for her. I, Lord, King of the chthonic gods, burn, set on fire, inflame the soul, the heart, the liver, the spirit of Gorgonia, whom Nilogenia bore, with love and affection for Sophia, whom Isara bore. Drive Gorgonia herself, torment her body night and day, force her to rush forth from every place and every house, loving Sophia, whom Isara bore, she, Gorgonia, surrendered like a slave. Astrological texts provide further evidence for the knowledge and existence of female same sex love in the Roman world. Astrology was both a science and an aspect of religion, and it spread from Babylonia throughout the Greek and Roman world. Handbooks, treatises, and poems laying out the practices of astrology containing numerous references to female homoeroticism. The alignments of heavenly bodies at the birth or conception could determine a person's same sex desire. But at the same time, such desires, especially women's love for women, could be deemed unnatural. Same sex desire also tended to be lumped together with other kinds of sexual transgressions, such as prostitution, promiscuity, and adultery. One astrologer, Dorotheos of Sidon, who lived in the 1st century CE, described women who do in women the act of man, suggesting that they are masculine. Likewise, Manetho, probably a contemporary, mentions tribads who perform male functions. In the 2nd century CE, the famous Alexandrian Ptolemy continued the ancient Greek tradition of associating femininity with passivity and masculinity with activity. He specified degrees of the masculinization of women. Some women take the active role with women in secret, but others make their desire public and even take women as their wives. These same points reappear in other later astrological texts, suggesting continuity across the centuries. On the one hand, we can see a notion that women who desire women were a category of person, made that way by the stars. They were tribads. Yet this was not exactly a way of dividing the world up into people who desire those of the same sex versus people who desire those of the other sex, for the crucial distinction was between people who take an active, that is, penetrating role in sexual encounters, versus those who take a passive, that is, enclosing role, and women could fall into both categories, although that was harder for the ancients to imagine in the case of women than in the case of men. The women who fall out of the picture entirely are those who are the partners of masculine women. Unlike men who desire men but take the active role, they are not given special consideration for their gender appropriate sexual behavior. They are not considered at all. At the end of the day, despite being made that way by the stars, women who love other women were licentious and unnatural in the eyes of the astrologers, but they existed. The same recognition of women who desire other women appears in the Roman medical texts, which also reflect on the notion that such women are masculine, in this case even physiologically, as in these writings, the notion emerges that women with an overly large clitoris could penetrate other women. Ceranos of Ephesus, a Roman physician in the 2nd century CE, considered tribads to suffer from mental illness that caused them to practice both kinds of love, rush to have sex with women more than with men, and pursue women with an almost masculine jealousy. Soranos, in a gynecological text, recommended clitoridectomy, the removal of at least part of the clitoris if it were overly large or immoderate, indicating the concern with the possibility of a woman penetrating another and a persistent male lack of imagination about what two women might do to pleasure one another. He provided precise directions for amputing the excess flesh of the clitoris. We have no way of knowing in what circumstances such surgeries may have taken place, or what Ceranos and his contemporaries thought the relationship was between the mental illness of desire for women and the physical condition of an enlarged clitoris. But in any case, his thinking and that of his translators and successors reinforced the idea that women's love for other women is unnatural and should be controlled. Guides to interpreting dreams also classified female same-sex sexuality as unnatural. Artemidoros of Daldes, in the 2nd century CE, wrote a guide to interpreting dreams. Although his interest was not in sexuality per se, but simply in understanding what dreaming about sex might mean, his classifications of dreams of women having sex fits with all the other ancient sources and corresponds to an Egyptian dream book that proclaimed that if a woman dreams that a woman has intercourse with her, she will come to a bad end. Dreams portended good or bad things, depending on whether that was dreamed was legal, illegal, or unnatural. All sorts of sexual acts between men fell into the legal category, but all sex between women was unnatural. Dream interpretation guides, then, like the medical and astrological texts, supported Bruton's argument that there was no or almost no tolerance for female same sex sexuality in Roman times. Bruton does suggest, at various points throughout her book, that marriage between women was a possibility in the ancient Mediterranean world, although her evidence is shaky enough that she truly suggests rather than argues the point. She cites a passage from Clement of Alexandria that refers to women getting married and marrying women contrary to nature. Lucian's passage in Dialogues of the Cortesians, in which the masculine Megilla calls another woman her wife, the astrologer Ptolemy's reference to women who have sex with other women and call them their lawful wives, a story by a romantic writer, and a funerary urn depicting two freed women with clasped hands, taking all these as intriguing hints of a social institution. The evidence strikes me as unconvincing. Critics question the meaning of the Greek word for marriage and marrying, pointing out that it is also used for the male role of sexual intercourse. They also have They also point to the nature of an ancient marriage, which had little to do with love, sexual desire, or companionship, and therefore makes little sense in thinking about a relationship between women. A more nuanced position, taking off from the funerary urn, which in late antiquity had been recut to turn one of the women into a man, points to the possibility that New Testament biblical references to pairs of women means the two women have formed missionary couples, comparable to husband wife teams in early Christianity. In an environment of dissociation from traditional family ties and sexual asceticism, the decision to live and work with another woman could have been a social, if not sexual, choice. This was, then, the world that launched the religion of Christianity, which has had a powerful impact on societal responses to love between women. Inhabitants of ancient Mediterranean world may have encountered references to female same-sex love in literature through magic and astrology, and in medical texts or guides to dream interpretation, but none of these sources accepted desire between women as natural or good. So the story of the demonization of love between women is not, as it is sometimes told, a tale of Christianity as the anti-sexual religion, overturning the culture of a sex-positive ancient world. The story is more complicated and more controversial, as we shall see. Ancient societies that valued rather than feared sexuality, Sparta, where sexuality was linked to the all-important task of producing warriors, Lesbos, Lesbos, with its appreciation for the beauty and talent of women, and the Indian of the Kama Sutra, the India of the Kama Sutra, with its multiple possibilities for pleasure, do seem to be more open to desire and love between women. Yet all the ancient societies, in contrast to the mythical society of the Amazons and the imagined world of Gyno society, valued men over women. The development of stratified societies with political structures and economic disparities set the stage for increased control of sexuality. Sometimes, because women were less important than men, what they did with one another was of no interest or consequence. Sometimes it seemed to have been titillating. But the same themes that emerge in Greek depictions of the Amazons, masculinity and independence, could seem very threatening indeed. What is truly striking in thinking about ancient worlds is the silence of women. That is why Sappho continues to play such a central role in thinking about love between women. How might our history change if the words of other women, those who commissioned erotic spells, for example, had survived? What if we could hear women's voices? Let us end this consideration of ancient worlds with a fragment, appropriately, from a series of poems that Erica Jong wrote about Sappho before she began her novel. Sappho, a footnote, reflects on the power of words. Sappho burned, and Christians burned, in her words. Oh my god, okay, let me restart. I'm very bad at poetry, guys. Sappho burned, and Christians burn. Her words. In the Egyptian desert, bits of papyri held notions of her flaming heart. Aphrodite smiles, remembering Sappho's words. If death were good, even the gods would die. You who put your trust in the words when flesh decays, know that even words are swept away, and what remains? As we move forward in time, we begin to hear a bit more from women, and we find possibilities of desire, love, and sex between women in what at first glance seems some unlikely places. I'll be right back. I need to close the door because my cat's like. Chapter 4. In Unlikely Places. 500 BCE to 1600 CE. For a very long time, from the waning of classical civilizations and the spread of the world religions to the rise of the European global dominance, the voices of women who loved women are no more than occasional whispers. Yet if we look hard enough and listen intently, we can find places where love between women could have flourished or, if not flourished, at least survived. In what might seem like unlikely places in covens, harems, and polygynous households, a mystical outpourings and heretical sects, in the practice of alternative religion. Women could desire, love, and have sex with other women. In some societies, such as those that understood that sex between co-wives might make harmonious households, such relations were not beyond the bounds of respectability. In others, the idea of sex between women was so horrifying that the authorities, whether secular or religious, wavered between willfully denying that such a thing could exist and condemning to death women who engaged in the unspeakable. Even then, some voices break through. Listen to the love letter of one Bavarian nun to another 12 centuries after Paul's letter to the Romans, introducing into Christian doctrine the denunciation of women's unnatural passions for one another. It is you alone I have chosen for my heart. I love you above all else. You alone are my love and desire. When I recall the kisses you gave me, and how with tender words you caressed my little breasts, I want to die, because I cannot see you. Such words of love remind us that what ought to have been was not always what was. What's religion got to do with it? In Erica Jong's version of Sappho's life, the great singer meets and falls in love with an Egyptian priestess, Isis, and prophesies a bleak future. In times to come, people will fear Eros and hate all pleasure. There will be a dark age in which all the sweets of life will turn bitter. It will last a very long time, she says. Her words might easily evoke the rise and spread of Christianity, with its ascetic streak and the renunciation of sexual pleasure. For the traditional tale of the transition from the sexual openness of the classical civilizations of Greek and Rome to a sexually repressive Christian dominated Europe pinpoints Christian doctrine and practice as the killer of Eros. But this interpretation has come under attack, especially by two scholars who we have already briefly met, coming from diametrically opposed positions. One, Bernadette Brooten, has already provided her fascinating evidence of recognition of love between women in the Mediterranean world. But we should start with the late John Boswell, author of the two controversial books on Christianity and primary male same-sex sexuality. In Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, Boswell uses his incredible erudition and notable linguistic skills to argue that Christianity was not to blame for hostility to same-sex relations. The biblical passages that have been taken as a condemnation either meant something else or considered same-sex sexual relations as a relatively trivial offense, and the church, as an institution, actually fostered same-sex love. Hatred of same-sex sexuality came not from the church fathers, but only beginning in the late 12th century from popular intolerance stirred up by the Crusades. Fear and hatreds of Jews, Muslims, and heretics spread to those perceived as sexually deviant and trickled up to religions and secular elites. From a late Roman world of openness to all sorts of sexualities and a flowering of gay culture in the 12th century urban revival, late medieval European shut down toleration, even glorification of same-sex love. Boswell has been criticized from many perspectives, especially for identifying gay people in the past, thus suggesting an essentialist transhistorical identity. But Bernadette Brooten is notable for pointing out that his argument about the acceptability of same-sex relations in Rome sometimes is based entirely on evidence about men. She writes from a lesbian feminist perspective that differentiates, both in the past and the present, between the male and female forms of same-sex sexuality. As we have seen, she insists that if we pay attention to what the sources tell us about women, the record looks entirely different. Although she provides evidence that female same-sex love existed, she is just as clear that it was viewed with disgust. So her point about the impact of Christianity is both similar to Boswell's. She does not see Christian doctrine as responsible for the condemnation of same-sex sexuality, and entirely different, since she paints a picture of persistent and continuous condemnation throughout the history of the Mediterranean world. The works of both scholars are an example of history with an agenda, absolving the Christian church from responsibility for hatred of same-sex sexuality. Boswell, to me, sounds disingenuous about this. He says in his preface that it is the job of the historian not to praise or blame, but merely to record and explain. He adds, this book is not intended to support or criticism of any particularly contemporary viewpoint, scientific or moral, regarding homosexuality. But, for me at least, it is hard to miss the passion that he puts into both defending the church and detailing the love of men for other men. Brooten is much more forthright. The last sentence of her book reads, by understanding our past, we may progress towards a more humane future, one in which we acknowledge the sacredness and holiness of a woman expressing her love for another woman. Perspective and agenda aside, what do these two historians tell us about the impact of Christianity on female same-sex love? In the case of Boswell, not much. He reports that Augustine told nuns that they should love one another in a spiritual rather than carnal way, and that virgins and married women should not indulge in shameless playing with each other. With regard to the early medieval penitentials, lists of penalties to be doled out by confessors for all sorts of sins that include sexual acts between women, Boswell points out that the penances were far less onerous for same-sex sexuality than for hunting by a priest. And finally, there are love letters between nuns in the monastery of Tagernsee, lines of which I quoted earlier, and a reference to the sole extant example of medieval love poetry written in a vernacular language by one woman to another. Yet this striking example from the 13th century is not quoted. More on that later. But most of what Boswell has to say about women concerns the passage in Romans that is the first denunciation of female same-sex sexuality and is the focus of the second half of Brooten's book. As we have seen, Brooten pulls together a wide variety of sources from the world in which Christianity emerged to argue that Paul's denunciation of female same-sex sexuality in Romans 1:26 is considered with Greek, Roman, and Jewish perspectives on love is consistent with Greek, Roman, and Jewish perspectives on love between women. The only real difference, she suggests, is that early Christian theology put male and female same-sex sexuality in the same conceptual category, although she also notes that condemnations largely only targeted those men who were enclosers, those who performed fellatio or received anal sex, but all women who engaged in same-sex sexuality as the violators of nature and law, leaving out men who played what the ancients thought of as the active or proper male role. Paul's letter to the Romans, written between 54 and 58 CE, is short and to the point about female same-sex sexuality. Paul is discussing people who have turned away from God in all sorts of ways. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Brooten sets this passage in the widest possible context, considering the interpretation of other scholars, Paul's intentions and the context of the Roman congregation to whom he was writing, debates on natural law, Jewish law, the writings of early church fathers, and the cultural context of the period. She rejects Boswell's argument that what Paul meant to condemn was people whose nature was heterosexual, but who engaged in same-sex acts, arguing Paul clearly saw sexual love between women as unnatural, as did the Roman world, and deserving of death. Having described all the different contexts that the Roman congregations Paul was addressing would have brought to his words, Brooten imagines what they may have heard. A Jewish woman thinks of the denunciation of male same-sex sex in Leviticus. An old pagan man remembers discussions of natural law. His wife, who sells food at a corner stall on the street, is reminded of two young women who came to her shop with their arms wrapped around each other. A slightly drunk male customer mutters that it is not natural and that they should be married, and wonders if they strap or something on. Brooten also imagines that women who loved other women may have sat in the congregation. Did they listen silently, feeling guilty and afraid that the congregation would find out? Or did they speak up, confident in their love for one another and for Christ? We cannot know. Their voices are absent. It is a lovely image, but given what Brooten has already told us, it is hard for me to imagine them confident in their love. Critics of Brooten's point out that there is one fundamental difference between Christian and earlier attitudes toward female same-sex love. It is only with the spread of Christianity that such love warrants the death penalty. There is quite a difference between being the butt of a joke in a Roman comedy and suffering death and eternal torment in hell after all. Brooten explores apocalyptic visions of those torments, ranging from having to cast oneself off a cliff over and over, to burning in a blazing pit, to running in a river of fire. So despite a history of condemnation of female same-sex love, it would seem that Christianity did, in fact, have something to do with the virulence of responses to love between women. But what about other religious traditions? Was Christianity more hostile than other world religions? As we have seen, Paul's proclamations can be seen as extensions of the Hebrew Bible's call for death for a man who lies with a male as with a woman. Leviticus defines this as an abomination committed by both men, but says nothing about sex between women. A rabbinical commentary on Leviticus, known as the Sifra, prohibits for Jews marriage practices attributed to the Egyptians and Canaanites, including marriage between women, which some later commentators interpreted as a reference to sexual relations. Both the Jerusalem Talmud, compiled around the 5th century CE, and the Babylonian Talmud, 6th century CE, discuss sexual practices that disqualify a woman from eating a priestly offering or marrying a priest. It is harlotry that is at issue, and the different schools disagreeing about whether two women who rub with each other are engaging in harlotry. Some dismissed it simply as obscenity. This is a pretty thin record of concern about the women having sex with other women. Perhaps, as we find in so many texts, it is just not important what women did with one another as long as they also married men and bore them children. Islam, emerging from the 7th century CE out of Jewish and Christian traditions, also has little to say about female same sex sexuality. The Quran, like the Hebrew Bible, is silent on the subject, although it follows the Bible in mentioning 5 times the story of Lot and Sodom. In Islamic texts from the late 12th century or early 13th century, reported that women practiced the vice of sodomy for 40 years among the tribes of Lot before the men took it up. Sharia, traditional law based on the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Hadith, is considered to condemn same sex sexuality. The Prophet is reported to have included women in his pronouncements. Doomed by God is who does what Lot's people did. No man should look at the private parts of another man, and no woman should look at the private parts of another woman. And no 2 men sleep under one cover, and no 2 women sleep under one cover. A decree in the Hadith calls for the stoning to death of both male partners, and early laws and sentencing carried out this kind of harsh penalty. Yet romantic love between men and boys flourished in early Islamic culture despite the condemnation of male same sex sexual acts. And as Islam spread across the Mediterranean with the Arab conquest of Spain in the 9th century, depictions of male love had an impact on medieval Europe as well. Ibn Dawood, a writer and jurist born in the late 19th century, celebrated the idea of passionate love between men in his Book of the Flower, dedicated to his friend Muhammad ibn Jami. Ibn Hazm, 994 to 1064, who wrote a treatise on love called The Dove's Neck Ring about love and lovers, referred to men's love for women and for other men in the same breath. He took great pains to emphasize that, however much he might have been tempted by the beauty of men, he would not engage in any physical activity with them. Despite the existence of Arabic romances featuring female lovers, Ibn Hazm did not extend this appreciation to same-sex erotic attraction to women. He reported knowing a woman who had bestowed her affections in ways not pleasing to Almighty God, something he called an abomination. A famous 11th century woman poet, Walada bint al-Mustafki, daughter of the Caliph of Cordova in Spain, the Arab Sappho, wrote poems to her female lover, Mujah, also a poet, but much of this work has been lost, presumably because of its homoerotic content. Walada, known for her sexual independence and multiple male lovers, wrote, "I give my cheek to whoever loves me, and I give my kiss to anybody who desires it." Another woman poet wrote, "I drank wine for love of flirting, and I shifted towards lesbianism for fear of pregnancy," although lesbianism is a translation of whatever she actually said. Still, the point is that Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, paid little official attention to love between women. The older major world religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, are less condemning of same-sex sexuality, although they also reveal contradictory attitudes. Hinduism, a diverse set of religious traditions originating earlier than any other major religion in India, has no one sacred text like the Bible or the Quran. A classical Hindu text from around 1000 BCE refers to the fruitless coupling of 2 men or 2 women. A text from the 2nd century CE called the Manavad Harmasutra described the same penalty for the upper caste men who copulated with other men as for those who have intercourse with women in a cart drawn by an ox, in water, or during the day. And this penalty was less than the one for the men who committed an unnatural crime with a female. In contrast, penalties for sex between women were more severe. Kanya, a young girl or virgin who pollutes another girl, suffered financial penalties and 10 lashes with a rod. A woman, that is, married woman, who polluted a girl, had her head shaved or 2 fingers cut off, or had to ride through the town on a donkey. Yet the same penalty applied to a man who manually penetrated a virgin, indicating that the real crime was stealing a girl's virginity. In contrast to men, higher caste women suffered less severe punishments than lower caste women. Some authorities assign the loss of fingers only to those from lower castes. Caste may also have played a role in deciding which Kanya was the guilty party, since that could be difficult to determine, depending on the sexual activity involved. Some commentaries on the law refer to insertion of fingers, others refer to oral sex, since the term used to describe the activity combines the root word that means enjoyment through eating and drinking, with a prefix specifying mutuality. Other Hindu texts took different and conflicting approaches. The Athasatra, a text thought to be from the 3rd century BCE, specified fines for different sexual offenses, with the least for intercourse with an animal, up to double for sex between women, and 4 to almost 8 times as much for sex between men. The Kama Sutra, as we have seen, describes in a non judgmental way a variety of sexual activities, including oral sex, which in other texts was likened to killing of a high caste person. Some women, according to the Kama Sutra, became addicted to the practice of cunnilingus and sought out women or men who would satisfy them. Despite the contradictions, it seems fair to say that female same sex sexuality was of relatively minor concern to classical Hinduism and was certainly not a cause for execution as in Christianity. Later, at least in part in reaction to the invasion by non Hindus, attitudes hardened. A commentator in the late 10th to early 11th century reported that when Kabul was conquered by the Muslims and the leader adopted Islam, he stipulated that he should not be bound to eat cow's meat nor to commit sodomy, clearly associating such practices with Islam, more blaming of foreigners. Buddhism, which emerged in India from the teachings of the Buddha in the 6th century to early 5th century BCE, like Hinduism, embraced conflicting positions on same sex sexuality in part, as with all religious traditions, because of variation across time and place. On the whole, however, its attitudes can best be described as neutral. Condemnation, when it occurred, came in the context of a renunciation of sexuality in general, since Buddhism extols the celibate life. Yet Buddhist societies did not expect everyone to give up sex, so praise for male sexuality and military prowess coexisted with the monastic ideal. In texts concerning lay life, same sex sexuality rarely appears as a transgression. There are almost no references to female same sex sexuality except for rules against such contacts in monastic orders, about which more later. In Indian Buddhism, condemnation of male sex, either as a violation of a monastic vow of celibacy or in case of which men take on the characteristics of a woman, sits side by side with homoerotic stories from the lives of the Buddha and his companions. Neutrality mixed with ambivalence also characterizes attitudes towards same-sex sexuality in China, although we know very little about specifically Buddhist Chinese attitudes. Both Confucianism and Taoism took a neutral stance, and Chinese emperors in the Han period, 206 BCE to 220 BCE, were known to take male lovers, so it is reasonable to assume that Buddhist monasteries may have seemed a desirable place for men with same sex desires, whether or not they acted on those inclinations. A legend about Kukai, the founder of the Japanese Shingon sect in the late 8th to early 9th century, credits him with bringing the practice of homosexuality from China to Japan. Unlike Hindus, blaming same sex sexuality on the Muslims, Japanese Buddhists venerated male lover. So, with these differences from place to place, Buddhism can be seen as more tolerant of male same sex sexuality than other world religions. Even more than in other religious tradition, however, we know very little about love between women. So what does religion have to do with it? Clearly, the major world religions differ in their doctrinal positions on same-sex sexuality, Christianity seemingly the most all-encompassing and negative. But all are similar in paying less attention to sex between women. either because the male authority did not think about it or because it did not really matter, since women had little choice but to marry or to enter a religious institution, or because nothing that two women could do together would really count as sexual. Yet at the same time, the sex segregated places, both domestic and institutional, that the different religious traditions shaped created space in which, in fact, love and sex between women could flourish. In women's spaces. What went on in women's spaces, whether monasteries or women's quarters of private houses, has been, in the historical record, largely left to men's imaginations. Whether denied access to men or neglected by husbands busy with other women, wives in sex segregated spaces could turn to other women, engaging in what men, when they thought of it, considered making do. The problem is, we have almost no direct evidence of what went on away from men's eyes. So, what are we to make of male fantasies? The long stretch of time from the incursions of what the Romans thought of as barbarians to the discovery of the New World was one of increasing global integration through conquest, trade, and travel. Europe was at first a backwater. The great civilization of the world flourished in the Middle East and Asia. As Islam, the first global civilization, spread around the Mediterranean and into Central Asia from the 7th century on, the practice of secluding women in separate quarters of households, also practiced in ancient Greece, gave rise to all sorts of fervid Orientalist imaginings, especially on the part of European men who associated harem life with everything erotic and exotic in the Islamic world. The military might of the Ottoman Empire represented a real threat to Western Europe in the period when travelers began to bring home tales of life in the harem. In the mid-6th century, a Venetian envoy to the Ottoman court in Constantinople described the lusty and lascivious wenches of the imperial harem. It is not lawful, he wrote, for anyone to bring aught in onto them, with which they may commit deeds of beastly uncleanliness, so that if they have a will to eat cucumbers, they are sent in onto them sliced to deprive them of the means of playing the wantons. Other travelers obsessed about the baths, where women sometimes became so fervently in love the one of the other, as if it were with men, that they handle and grope them everywhere at their pleasure. Much later, Richard Burton, the 19th century British explorer, a scholar who translated The Thousand and One Nights, which includes a story about men seeing his beloved kissing her maid, describes harems as hotbeds of sapphism and tribadism. A British book from the mid 20th century reported that Iraqis believe that women in harems kiss and make love out of sadness. And in an over-the-top depiction, a 1950s account, The Jewel and the Lotus, a historical survey of the sexual culture of the East, ascribed wild long goings-on in the harem. Isolated in enormous seraglios, females were generally given over to fanatic sapphism, sayakut, employing the ancient substitutes for the appeasing phallus, the tongue, candle, banana, and artificial penis. In the restricted harem, Esh Psyche El Bezre, one who teaches the art of rubbing clitoris against clitoris, taught every girl in Sapphic sciences. To solace her in long hours of desire for the male, nearly every concubine had her own private companion, whom she styled Mersenne or Rihane, Myrtle, and with whom she practiced all the Sapphic pleasures. The consistency of such accounts over the centuries is striking. Despite the Orientalist fascination with the Islamic world, it was not only foreign men who imagined the goings-on in women's quarters. Muslim historians reported that Musa al-Hadi, ruler of the Abbasid Empire in the 8th century, heard rumors that two of the women in his harem were lovers, dispatching spies who saw them embrace and as a result had them beheaded. A 13th century text by Tunisian born jurist Shihab al Din Ahmed al Tifashi included a section on tribalism, including both positive and negative statements. One anecdote relates a conversation between two men. An important man says, "I want to know how women practice sex between them." And an impudent man replies, "If you would like to know that, enter your house a bit at a time." In another tidbit, a man is told that his wife practices tribalism, and he responds, "Yes, I ordered her to do that," explaining, "Because it is softer on her labia, purer for the opening of her vulva, and more worthy than the penis approaching her, that she knows its superiority." It was not only in the Middle East that women supposedly whiled away their days making love with one another. The Kama Sutra addresses same-sex sexual activity in something that went on in women's quarters. They dress up as a foster sister or girlfriend or servant girl like a man and relieve their desire with dildos or with bulbs, roots, or fruits that have that form. This was a practice that Vatsayana, a compiler of the text, associated with Oriental customs in a colonized part of the empire. A 12th century commentary on the erotic text connected women's domestic spaces with the household of courtesans. Sometimes, in the secret of their inner rooms, with total trust in one another, they, women, lick each other's vulvas, just like whores. Several medieval Bengali texts tell the story of how two co-wives gave birth to Bhagiratha, an important Hindu figure who brought the sacred river of Ganga to earth. In the 4th century, it is interesting to note, Bengal was the center of goddess worship. The stories differ in some details, but in all cases, Dilipa, the husband of the co-wives, dies without a male heir. In one version, a priest advises the wives to have sexual intercourse, with one taking on the desire of a man. In another version, the god Shiva goes to the window of Dilipa to inform them that one will bear a son through intercourse with the other. The two wives of Dilipa took a bath. The two young women lived together in extreme love. Each of them knew the other's intentions. They enjoyed love play, and one of them conceived. In yet another version, the two women, this time with names Chandra and Mala, are fired by Madan, the god of love, with the desire to have sex, and one of them unexpectedly conceives. Burning with desire induced by Madan, Chandra and Mala took each other in embrace, and each kissed the other. Chandravati played the man, and Mala the woman. The two women dallied and made love. Their son, Bhagiratha, was born of mutual enjoyment between two vaginas. Other Indian texts also tell of love between co-wives. A Sanskrit play from the late 3rd to early 4th century, Swapnavasavadatam, Dream of Vasavadatta, tells the story of Queen Vasavadatta, who has to fake her death and flee the country in disguise. She ends up in the care of a princess, Padmavati, who is to become her own husband's new bride. The two women are attracted to each other and become very close. In a much later version of the story, the relationship is spelled out further. Padmavati sees the queen and falls in love with her at first sight. She notes Vasavadatta's shape, her delicate softness, the graceful manner in which she sat down and ate, and also the smell of her body, which was fragrant as the blue lotus. They became co-wives when Vasavadatta's identity is revealed, and they ultimately became of one heart. A slightly different version comes from a story about Brahmani, the beautiful daughter of a Brahmin who refuses to marry because she does not want to be separated from her dear friend Ratnavati. Brahmani's mother arranges for both girls to be married into the same household. Through complicated circumstances, both end up becoming unmarriageable, so they are unable to in woman-to-woman bonding, live together in woman-to-woman bonding for the rest of their lives. All these cases from the Indian context emphasize the benefits of love between co-wives for the family and community. Not all cultures were so welcoming. In the Siamese court during the Ayutthaya period, 14th to 18th centuries, the king forbade Len Fuen playing with friends for his concubines. Any woman having sex with another woman, like a man has sex with a woman, will be punished by being whipped 50 times and will be tattooed on the neck and paraded around the palace. Epic poems from the 19th century mention Fuan among concubines. In one, women expert at the practice seduce women from another kingdom, who then delight so much in making love to women that they refuse advances from men. A temple mural also portrays women touching each other's breasts, flirting with each other, and being punished for sexual activity. In 1856, King Rama IV warned his daughters not to engage in Len Fuan, making clear that it was a known practice. In a variety of cultures, other kinds of sources also depict sexual acts between women, presumably enjoyed in the privacy of women's quarters. An illustration from a 17th century translation of a 12th century Muslim Indian text shows a woman holding a bow with a dildo as the arrow, aiming it between the spread legs of another woman. A Japanese erotic encyclopedia from the 17th century included an illustration of a double-headed dildo for the use by two women. Chinese sexual handbooks depicted mutual masturbation between women, and prints and paintings featured complicated sexual acts. One handbook on the marital intercourse described by two women lying on top of each other, their legs entwined so that their jade gates pressed together. They then moved in a rubbing and jerking fashion against each other, like fishes gobbling flies or water plants from the surface. As they became more excited, the mouths widened, and choosing this position carefully, great Lord Yang thrust between them with his jade root. They moved in unison until all three shared the ultimate simultaneously. Literary texts, too, portray women enjoying one another. A 17th century Chinese short story, The Pearl Soon Shirt, depicts an older woman helping her male patron seduce a beautiful young woman by first exciting her with dirty and obscene talk. In another portrayal, in another tale portraying women as likely to be aroused by other women, two 16-year-old girls sharing a bed begin touching each other with shame, move to kissing each other, just as a man kisses a woman with passion and without shame, and then they observe their mothers having sex with the same man, become so aroused that they make love with fingers, and began regularly to engage in sex play, alternating roles as male. In a 17th century Chinese play, Pitying the Fragrant Companion, a young married woman falls in love with a younger unmarried woman she met at a temple. They make vows as lovers in front of the Buddha's image. And then the married woman talks her husband into taking her lover as a second wife. Late imperial Chinese literature from the late 16th century to the early 20th century abounds in tales of co-wife lovers happily married to the same man. In a comedy by Li Yu titled Lian Qiang Ban, Women in Love, two women who love each other work hard to persuade their father to allow them to marry the same man so they can live together. It is worth noting that in some of these fictional tales, romantic love between women is primary, whereas in others, co-wives turn to each other to make their marriages work. As Lee says at the beginning of Women in Love, if a woman transforms the tumor of jealousy into the embryo of passion, it will be no ordinary infatuation. Is any of this literature a reflection of reality, or is much of it a male pornographic fantasy? It is hard to know, given the available sources. Historical accounts describe slave women in the 14th century harems of Mumluks, slave soldiers who converted to Islam and came to rule in Egypt, riding horses, hunting, shades of the Amazons, drinking wine, indulging in debauchery with one another, and accumulating wealth, just like the Mumluks. Another scholar reports that in the Chinese imperial harem, multiple concubines satisfied each other's sexual needs while on the waiting list to meet with the emperor. and that multiple wives of wealthy men also initiated intimate alliances among themselves. Relying on erotic manuals that portray group intercourse known as the heavenly and earthly net, this scholar notes that women were likely to have had sexual contact with each other in this way, making it equally likely that they may have taken up with each other later without the presence of their common male partner. In Japan, during the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, as well, the shogun's harem and a public access harem of professional entertainers were wont to engage in lesbian affairs to avoid the considerable risk of adultery. They could make use of the penis substitutes, including the dual plover, ryochidori, which allowed the two women to pleasure each other. In the Javanese court of Surakarta, in the mid-19th century, a scandal erupted when a woman was discovered making love to other royal women. A Dutch report on the incident explained that when the ruler discovered that the women would be lying beside each other in various places, that among their indecencies by way of a piece of wax, which had been shaped in the form of the private part of a man, they would be amidst each other. He outlawed the practice, as they might never be interested in love with men anymore. In African societies, too, including among the Nyakusa, the Mongo, and the Nupe of Nigeria, the Tswana of southern Africa, and the Azande of southern Sudan, we have reports of relationships formed between co-wives of chiefs and kings. British anthropologist E. E. Evans Pritchard, who studied the Azande in the 1930s, necessarily relied on reports from male Azande who told him that sex-starved wives turned to one another. Wives would cut a sweet potato or a manioc root in the shape of a male organ, or use a banana for the purpose. Two of them would shut themselves in a hut, and one would lie on the bed and play the female role, while the other, with the artificial organ tied around her stomach, played the male role. They then reversed roles, he tells us. A ruler sometimes gave his daughter a slave girl for sex. Although apparently known among the Zande men, the practice was feared. In a culture in which witchcraft played a central role, sex between women could be dangerous, even fatal to a husband. Zande men reported that once a woman began to have sex with other women, she was unlikely to stop because she no longer had to wait for her husband to please her. The deep connections that formed between women could be formalized through a ritual involving pledges of mutual support, and husbands, who had to give permission for their wives to take part in the ritual, found it difficult not to do so. Still, we do not really know if such sources are accurate about what women really did. What we do know is that polygynous households provided the opportunity for desire between co-wives, and that some societies considered this acceptable and others did not. Another woman's space potentially ripe for love between women was the convent or monastery. Just as religious or cultural traditions that allowed for polygyny prepared fertile ground for relationships among wives and concubines and servants, so too sex-segregated religious institutions facilitated same-sex relationships despite vows of celibacy. In Vinaya, the Buddhist canon of monastic rules referred to same-sex sexual acts between women, mutual masturbation among nuns was treated as a relatively minor offense, and not surprisingly, there were fewer references to female than to male same-sex acts in Buddhist monasteries. Indian Buddhist monastic rules forbade two nuns to share the same bed cover. A Japanese sexologist written in the early 20th century listed nuns, as well as servants in the women's quarters of feudal households, as among those who may have developed a taste for same-sex sexual acts because they could not engage in normal sexual relations. As Buddhism spread in China during the Ming Dynasty, 1363 to 1644, nuns came under increasing suspicion of having sexual connections with one another. Yet Chinese literature depicts men as accepting of or indifferent to such possibilities. A male character in one novel, Dream of the Red Chamber, Huang Lo Meng, is charmed when he comes upon a nun and another young woman in the intimate moment. Disapproval stemmed mainly from the Confucian rejection of Buddhist monasteries, disrupting disruption of family bonds and procreation. As the letters between the nuns in Bavaria suggest, we know a bit more about love between women in Christian convents, if mostly from prohibition and punishments. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, centered originally in the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire, which survived the decline of the western part of the empire, same sex relations were treated less harshly than in the West. Female same sex relations merited little notice and were not punished with severity. Western Christian authorities, on the other hand, took Paul's letter to the Romans to heart. St. Ambrose in the 4th century explained that Paul testified that God, being angry with the human race because of their idolatry, it came about that a woman would desire a woman for the use of foul lust. Centuries later, Peter Abelard interpreted against nature to mean against the order of nature, which created women's genitals for the use of men, and conversely, and not so women could cohabit with women. Most influential was Thomas Aquinas, who catalogued 4 categories of vice against nature under the sin of lust: masturbation, bestiality, coitus in an unnatural position, and copulation with an undue sex, male with male and female with female. Yet early penance manuals that included sex between women as a sin did not call for severe penalties. The Penitential of Theodore, from England in the 7th century, specified 3 years' penance for an unmarried or widowed woman who practiced vice with a woman, the same amount of time as for masturbation. For a married woman, it was a greater sin. The Penitential of Bade, a century later, took up the question of sexual transgressions among nuns. Specifically, if nuns with a nun using an instrument, 7 years. Although whether the greater penalty was because of the religious vows or the instrument is not clear. Hincmar of Reims, of the 9th century, elaborated on the use of instruments, expressing the confusion that medieval authorities experienced imagining what women might do with one another. They do not put flesh to flesh in the sense of genital organs of one within the body of the other, since nature precludes this, but they do transform the use of the member in question into an unnatural one, in that they are reported to use certain instruments of diabolical operation to excite desire. Lack of clarity about how women could have sex and what kind of sin it constituted persisted in both church and secular law. Monastic communities took steps to avoid nuns falling into sin with one another. St. Augustine, in the 5th century, instructed her sister, who was taking vows, to take care to feel spiritual, not carnal love for her sisters. Monastic rules specified that nuns should not visit in one another's cells, should leave their doors unlocked, and should avoid ties of special friendship. In the 7th century, Donatus of Byzancone warned about such friendships. It is forbidden lest any take the hand of another for delight, or stand or walk around or sit together. He included the use of the endearment little girl and instructed that each nun should sleep in a separate bed, that lights should burn all night, and that the sisters should sleep in their clothes. Later church councils also forbade nuns to sleep together and required a lamp to be kept lighted all night in the dormitories. Such rules suggest the possibility. A fascinating glimpse into those possibilities can be gleaned from the letters of Shenut, the male head of the White Monastery in 5th century Egypt. The women in the White Monastery, kept separate from the men, nevertheless lived under the same rule and same authority. Shenut apparently relied on reports of infractions of discipline from the women in the community and metered out punishments accordingly. In one letter, he listed individuals who had stolen, argued, launched physical assault, lied, been stupid, or expressed homoerotic desire. Here is what he wrote about the letter. Thais, the sister of Phaci the younger. This one, concerning whom you sent to us, saying, she runs after Sansno in friendship and physical desire. 15 blows of the stick. Sansno, too, appears in the list of guilty of even more. This one, who says it is others whom I teach, 40 blows of the stick, because sometimes she ran after her neighbor in friendship, and sometimes she lied about empty things. The punishment consisted of blows on the bottom of the feet, a painful traditional Egyptian punishment. The words in the original Coptic language for both friendship and physical desire refer clearly to erotic feelings. The head of a nearby monastery, a contemporary of Shinut, named Horsio- Horsesios, wrote a lengthy attack on wicked and evil friendship. Shinut used the term carnal friendship in his denunciations, stating, "And as for those among us, whether man or woman, who will be caught being friends to their neighbor in physical desire, they will be cursed in all of their deeds that they do." He also warned about passion and physical contact. "Cursed is a woman among us who will run after younger women, and anoint them, and is filled with a passion. And those also who will sleep, two on a mat, or those who will come too close as they might touch or feel each other only in passion and desire, they shall be cursed, whether man or woman." The sources are silent about the actual feelings of cardinal friends. The evidence from Egypt connects the prohibitions against friendship among nuns to an actual case, although we learn little about what the punished nuns, Thais and Sanos, did or felt. Even more revealing, although still from the perspective of male authorities, is the story of Bernadette Carlini, a 17th century abbess of the convent of the Mother of the God in Pescia, Italy, whose mystical claims led eventually to revelations of her sexual conduct with another nun. Historian Judith Brown discovered her remarkable story quite by accident, and only because Bernadetta ran afoul of the church hierarchy for an entirely different reason. Placed in a newly established convent by her parents at the age of 9, Bernadetta became an abbess at the young age of 13, a result of her mystical visions and, ultimately, the appearance of stigmata, the wounds of Christ, on her hands. Such a distinction drew attention and favor to the convent. But that was not all. According to Bernadetta, one night Christ came to her and removed her heart from her chest, then returned 3 days later and gave his own heart to her, assigning her a guardian angel named Splenditello to guard her purity. Christ returned once again to instruct her that he wanted to marry her in a public ceremony at the convent. The convent's priests and confessors, who had already permitted Bernadetta in an altered state to give sermons to the nuns, agreed to the ceremony. Jesus, Mary, and a number of saints appeared to Bernadetta, although not to the others, and Jesus put a ring, also not visible to anyone but Bernadette, on her finger. He spoke through Bernadetta, telling of her visions in childhood, praising her virtues. After all this, Bernadetta emerged from her trance and acted as if nothing special had happened. But enough was unusual. Bernadetta's quest for a public event, the lavish words of praise for herself that Jesus spoke through her, that the church authorities decided to investigate. Although mystical happenings may have been rare, they were not unknown, but neither were fraudulent mystics. Because Bernadetta was already attracting a following of her local community, the authorities decided it was time to confirm or disprove her claims. It was this investigation that revealed the immodest acts in which Bernadetta engaged with a younger nun, Bartolomeo Crivelli, who had been assigned to share Bernadetta's cell and watch over her during a period in which she was tormented by visions of handsome young men who beat her and tried to corrupt her soul. A first investigation in 1619 found no cause for alarm. But in 1622 and 1623, a higher official, a papal nuncio, sent several of his men to investigate again, possibly prompted by another mystical event. Bernadetta's death and return to life, or by dissatisfaction of the nuns chafing under Bernadetta's firm control. The new investigation uncovered evidence of faked miracles and doubts about Bernadetta's character, and this time the nuns began to talk. The real shocker came from Bartolomea, who told of the immodest acts Bernadette had forced on her in the guise of the guardian angel Splenditello. In handwriting presumably made shaky by the revelations, the scribe took down Bartolomeo's testimony. This sister Bernadetta, then, for 2 continuous years, at least 3 times a week, in the evening after disrobing and going to bed, would wait for her companion to disrobe, and, pretending to need her, would call. When Bartolomeo would come over, Bernadetta would grab her by the arm and throw her by force on the bed. Embracing her, she would put her under herself, kissing her as if she were a man. She would speak words of love to her, and she would stir on top of her so much that both of them corrupted themselves, and thus by force she held her sometimes 1, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 hours. Imagine the horror of the investigators. Sent to find out if Bernadetta was a fraud, they now had to determine what else she was. They questioned Bartolomeus further about the two women's relationship. Learning that Bernadetta kissed Bartolomeo's breast and grabbed her hand by force, putting it underneath herself, she would have her put her fingers into her genitals, and holding it there, she stirred herself so much that she corrupted herself. And also by force, she would put her hand under her companion and her fingers into her genitals and corrupted her. These were immodest acts for sure, but what kind? That was the question. Bernadetta never admitted any participation in these acts, her male angel alter ego proving useful in this way. She did, however, in a final investigation, admit that she had been tricked by the devil. She stopped having visions and took to living as an ordinary nun under the rule of the new abbess. Apparently, the authorities decided that the two sisters had not committed sodomy, which would have condemned them to die at the stake. Instead, Bernadetta lived out the rest of her life in prison in the convent, and Bartolomea seemingly returned to the normal life of a nun. This case is remarkable for the description of sexual acts between women, even if the description was designed to protect the teller from the crime. We can never know what really went on, of course. Were they lovers? Bernadetta, in the guise of her male angel, told Bartolomea she was melting for love of her and promised to be her beloved. Was she in love and expressing her love and sexual desire in the only way she knew? Was she a clever woman who found a way to get what she wanted? Or did she too believe in Splenditello, who in her eyes acts made the acts she engaged in with Bartolomeo not sinful? If we cannot know what the two nuns really felt, we do at least learn something about what 17th century Christian nuns may have done together. Spanish novelist Jesus Fernandez Santos, in his extraordinary dark novel Extramuros, imagines what went on in the story of a nearly identical case. In a poor convent in Spain during a terrible drought, in the midst of the Inquisition, a nun falls ill and is attended to by another sister, who narrates the novel. Death is everywhere. The convent is falling into ruin, and there seems to be no hope. The nameless sister recovers from her illness and recounts to her companion a dream, stimulated by the theory of a saint they had read together. The saint had received the stigmata, attracting attention and visitors from across the land and making her convent famous and rich. In the sister's dreams, she sees that their own wretched convent grow and prosper. Gradually, she reveals her plan to her companion, taking her into talking her into wielding a knife to cut her palms and keeping quiet for the good of the convent. The plan works. The stigmata are accepted. Townspeople flock to the convent. The nun's patron comes to visit, and he even entrusts his daughter to the house. The saint, as she comes to be called, is elected prioress. But jealousy and conflict within the convent erupt, and eventually the two nuns are taken away to be tried. They languish for years as the saint is slowly poisoned by her wounds, and her lover loses her sight in the dark of the prison. But the way the story differs profoundly from the Bernadette and Bartolomeus is that the Spanish nuns are already lovers, and it is out of love that the narrator goes along with the plan. Yet their relationship never enters the investigation, despite the fact that the prioress catches them together and warns them against such special friendship. It is fiction, of course, but Santos provides another possible way to think about what may have happened to Bernadetta and Bartolomeo. He sensitively depicts the two women's relationship, how over time their friendship ripened, bringing love in its wake shortly after. One night, the saint arrives in her sister's cell. When we proceeded to give each other the kiss of peace, as at other times, her mouth lingered long on my cheek. The soon-to-be saint asks if her friend loves her still. She thinks in response, I was still flesh of her flesh, voice of her voice, breath of her breath, as I had been the very first time back in the spring. When the narrator, finally compelled by love, tries to plunge the knife into her lover's hand, she cannot. Instead of wounding it, I begin to kiss it, beginning with the fingers, then following the path of her pale veins till both of us were lying on the bed, united and vanquished, on top of the miserable quilt. It was a dream like so many others in the past, dead now, in which love and will lost themselves till daybreak, when the two of us, locked in each other's arms, trembling, consoled each other, seeking the other, the hurried pounding of our blood making us one. It was like enjoying an agony eerily desired, like wax that melts and dies in the heat of a flame, like facing the world and sating ourselves with passion forever. A glorious madness, a splendid folly, an abundance of true carnal pleasure. It is a rapturous description of love and passion behind the convent walls, although of course shaped by late 19th century sensibilities. Could such a love have flowered between Bernadetta and Bartolomeo? Less rapturous, perhaps, but historical rather than fictional, are the meager scraps of writing by nuns professing their love for a special friend. There is the Bavarian nun who sent all the love there is to her love. Why do you want your only one to die, who, as you know, loves you with soul and body, who sighs for you at every hour, at every moment, like a hungry little bird? There is a letter from Hadwich, a 13th century Flemish Beguine, a member of an uncloistered, independent movement of religious women, who wrote centrally about her love for Christ. My heart, soul, and senses have not a moment's rest, day or night. The flame burns constantly in the very marrow of my soul. Yet she also expressed in the joint letter to her sisters a special earthly love for, and disappointment in, one of them. Great sorrow, also, in my behalf, whether I am anything to her or nothing. Could I fully be all that in my love I wish to be for her? I would gladly do so. Now that she has other occupations and can look on quietly and tolerated my heart's afflictions, she lets me suffer. And there's Bernadetta's reported profession of love for Bartolomeo. We know a bit of more from the life of Hildegard of Bingen, an 11th century Benedictine abbess and visionary who formed an intensely emotional commitment to a younger nun, Ricardus, whom she deeply cherished as her dearest daughter. According to the official story of Hildegard's life, Ricardus had bound herself to Hildegard in loving friendship in every way. When Ricardus was elected abbess of another monastery in 1151, Hildegard launched a letter-writing campaign to prevent her leaving. She pleaded with Ricardus' mother, "Do not disturb my soul and draw bitter tears from my eyes and fill my heart with bitter wounds." When that had no effect, she wrote to the archbishop and then the pope himself, alternately charging that Ricardus' appointment presented the sale of an ecclesiastical office and insisting that it was God's will that Ricardus stay by her side. But it was to no avail. The Pope threw the matter back in the lap of the Archbishop. Only one letter from Hildegard to Ricardus has survived. The younger nun died shortly after Hildegard sent it. In it, Hildegard wrote of her grief at the separation, as did the Bavarian nun to her absent friend, moving from imagery of mother-daughter to that of a widow dead spouse, suggesting both her conviction of the rightness of her love and her awareness of the perspectives of others. She wrote, "I so love the nobility of your character, your wisdom, your chastity, your spirit, and indeed every aspect of your life, that many people have said to me, 'What are you doing?' So although we may never really know what went on in women's spaces, either women's quarters or convents or monasteries, the prohibitions that and the worries and the imaginings of husbands and religious figures and the occasional scraps of evidence of love or sex between women are suggestive. At the very least, we might conclude, if men could imagine what two women might do left on their own to their own devices, no pun intended, Why could women not do so? Mystics, heretics, and witches. In the Christian tradition, it was not only nuns who might fashion same sex relations in the context of religious life. The line between holiness and evil, as we can see in the case of Bernadette Carlini and the saint of Santos fiction, was profound but also tricky. Women mystics had the potential to challenge the gender order by behaving in unseemly ways in their altered states of consciousness, as did Bernadette in preaching to her flock. They might also express erotic desire, as did Bernadette. Were they possessed by God or the devil? That was always the question. In the case of heretics and witches, the answer was clear. Women in these categories raised the possibility, if only that, of same sex eroticism. Women mystics, for example, like Bernadette, often focused on the wounds of Christ. A biographer of 14th century mystic Catherine of Siena described her vision of Jesus offering the wound in his side. Drink, daughter, from my side, and by the drought of your soul shall become enraptured with such delight that your very body, which for my sake you have denied, shall be inundated with its overflowing goodness. Drawn close in this way to the outlet of the fountain of life, she fastened her lips upon the sacred wound, and still more eagerly the mouth of her soul, and there she drank her thirst. Scholars dispute whether this image should be understood as a metaphor for maternal nursing or conolingus, with their wound representing the vulva. On the side of the same-sex eroticism and visual evidence from the 14th century, close-up illustration of the wound in Christ's side, looking remarkably like a vulva. The devotional text designed for women encouraged them to touch, kiss, suck, and enter the wound. Or considered the devotion of the Virgin Mary of Hildegard of Bingen, who so longed for her sister Ricardus. Her musical compositions can be seen as homoerotic adoration of Mary, counterparts to nuns' effusive love for Christ that is often described as heterosexual in nature. Your innards held joy, just as grass on which dew falls when greenness floods into it. Thus did it happen to you, O mother of all joy. Hildegard was also known for her knowledge of the body and herbal lore, and she wrote about female sexual pleasure. When the breeze of pleasure proceeds from the narrow of a woman, it falls into her womb, which is near the navel, and moves the woman's blood to pleasure. Although Hildegard's considered carnal pleasure a sign of the fall of man and explicitly denounced same-sex sexual activity, a woman who takes up devilish ways and plays a male role in coupling with another woman is most vile in my sight. She nevertheless connected women's spiritual devotion and sexuality in ways that can be considered homoerotic. Hedwig, the 13th century Beguine, who met lamenting the faithfulness of her sister Sarah, wrote passionately of God as love, using the name Mine, also used in German and Dutch secular poetry. Like other mystics, her poetry was rapturously homoerotic. I greet that I love with my heart's blood. My senses wither in the madness of Mine. O dearly loved maiden, that I say so many things to you comes to me from fresh fidelity. Under the deep touch of Mine, I suffer, I strive after the height, I suckle with my blood, I tremble, I cling, I give. Beloved, if I loved a beloved, be you Mine, my beloved. Another female mystic, Marjorie Kemp, a married English woman who had given birth to 14 children in the early 15th century, had a vision and eventually persuaded her husband to live an ascetic life with her. She began to travel around to holy sites, including the Holy Land, and to weep and pray loudly about the Passion of Christ. She was often disruptive in her shrieking and sobbing. She more than once came under investigation for heresy, and she also raised suspicion that she intended to take wives away from their husbands. In the book of her life that she dictated to a scribe, Marjorie told of being interrogated by the mayor of Leicester, who accused her of ill intentions, to take our wives away from us and lead them with you. A church official later worried that she had advised women to forsake her husband. Like Hildegard and other female mystics, Marjorie was devoted to the Virgin Mary, identifying with her grief at the loss of her son. She was inclined to burst out crying in the middle of sermons. During a trip to Rome, her outburst suggested passion. She turned herself first on one side, then the other, with great sobbing, unable to keep herself stable because of the unquenchable fire of love burning in her soul. Such drama attracted the attention of other women. The good woman, having compassion for her sorrow and greatly marveling at her weeping and crying, loved her much more. If she annoyed the men who were preaching, not so the loving woman. They, desiring to console and comfort her, prayed her, and in a way compelled her to come home with them, desiring that she should not go away from them. Marjorie's weeping and visions of Mary and the body of Christ, and the reaction of women to her, take on homoerotic overtones. When the good woman saw this creature weeping, sobbing, and crying so wonderfully and mightily that she was nearly overcome by it, they prepared a good soft bed and laid her upon it, and comforted her as much as they could. Christ's message to Marjorie in one vision suggested how important the company of women was to her. I will take you by the hand in heaven, and my mother by the other hand, and so shall you dance in heaven with other holy maidens and virgins. Christian mystics were not the only women to express same-sex eroticism. 14th century mystical texts from India also suffused devotion to God with homoeroticism. Janabai was a female mystic poet who depicted the deity as a woman, sometimes a devotee of intimate friends, sometimes a mother. In one verse, God washes and braids her hair, a definitive female activity. Sitting among the basil plants, Jenny undoes her hair. God takes some butter and oils from her hair. It says, Jenny has no one, and pours the water on her. Jenny tells everyone, my friend is bathing me. If appropriate spiritual devotion might be expressed erotically in whatever religious tradition, spiritual deviance might, medieval Christian authorities believed, lead to sexual deviance. Both heretics and witches were thought to engage in lewd acts, sometimes women with women. Sexual impropriety, often heterosexual, was a charge often thrown with accusations of inappropriate beliefs. 13th century Europe saw the rise of many heresies, a response to the intellectual and spiritual flowering of the 12th century and Reform movement within the Catholic Church. Although heretical belief could also take a number of forms, most shared a critique of the church hierarchy, and it's worth of noting that women often played central roles in heretical sects. One of the most important of these heresies, and one of the most often connected to same-sex sexuality, was Bogomilism, Bogomilas, which originated in Bulgaria, spread to Central Europe, where followers organized the Cathar Church, and then developed a stronghold in southern France, where followers were known as Albigensians. Although heretical sects tended to emphasize asceticism, their enemies accused them of the opposite. Gubert of Nogent, a bishop in the early 12th century, was the first to add charges of sodomy to the standard tales of orgies. He described the Cathar heretics of southern France engaging in extramarital and promiscuous heterosexual relationships, adding also that men are known to be with women and women with women. Most charges focused on male same-sex sexuality, and in fact, association of heresy and sodomy can be seen in the English term bugger, a translation of the French les bougres, which connected the Albigensians to their origins in Bulgaria. The Inquisition in colonial Mexico also uncovered cases in which women's intense religiosity found expression in heretical and sexual ways. A 1596 heresy trial of a devout Mexican woman named Marina de San Miguel, revealed that among other crimes, she and another woman had kissed and hugged, and Marina put her hands on her breasts, and she came to pollution 10 or 12 times, twice in the church. In 1621, a Spanish priest reported that a young woman, Augustina Ruiz, had confessed to regular masturbation, sometimes accompanied by fantasies about Virgin Mary in which she came to her in her bed to hug and kiss her. They would sit with their dishonest parts rubbing each other. The association of heresy and sexual deviation also emerges in a bizarre story about the 15th century female vampire in Bohemia. Barbara von Chili, a powerful noblewoman married to King Sigismund of Hungary and Bohemia. Toward the end of her life, in a political struggle with the powerful Habsburg family, she threw her support to the Hussites, a heretical sect familiar to what later developed as Protestantism. Protestantism, yeah. After her death, her enemies accused her of associating with heretics, profaning communion by drinking actual blood, thus qualifying her as a vampire, and maintaining a female harem and engaging in sex with young girls. The historical Barbara von Chili is probably the model for a lesbian vampire tale written by the 19th century Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Funa. In this version, there are no heretics, but young girls dreaming of a lovely woman who visits them at night and kisses their throats and caresses them. The fictional Count Dracula may in fact have been based on 16th century Countess Elizabeth Bartholy, who wore men's clothes, spent time with an aunt known to have women as lovers, and was fond of torturing and killing female servants. The legend had it that she bathed in the blood of the young girls to maintain her youthful appearance. The charges of sexual orgies, including sex with the devil, the churchmen and lay authorities developed as heretics, slide easily into the accusation of witchcraft against women in medieval and early modern Europe. In 1233, Pope Gregory the Ninth described the orgies following initiation ceremonies of heretics and witches. When this ceremony is over, the lights are put out, and those present indulge in the most loathsome sensuality, having no regard to sex. If there are more men than women, men satisfy one another's depraved appetites. Women do the same for each other. A tract published during the trial of witches in Arras, France, in 1460, made the same kind of connection. Sometimes, indeed, describable outrages are perpetrated in exchanging women by order of the presiding devil, by passing on a woman to another woman and a man to another man. Witches supposedly sealed their pact with the devil by having intercourse with him, and sexual deviance of all kinds was central to the supposed rituals of the witches. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of the Witches, the 15th century manual of witch hunting, closely linked witchcraft to sexuality and to women's nature. All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women's insatiable. A 16th century tract about witches in Fez, Morocco, called them sahakat, which in Latin would be ficachises, which they have sexual relations among themselves in a damnable fashion. If on occasion attractive women come to them, the witches are inflamed with love, just as young men are for girls, and in the guise of demon they ask that the woman lie with them as payment. Witch hunting in Europe peaked in the 16th and 17th century, by which time the vast majority of the accused women were women. One common accusation lodged against witches was that they caused male impotence, sometimes quite literally, by separating penises from the male bodies. As the Malleus Maleficarum put it, witches sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest, or shut them up in a box where they move themselves like living members, and eat oats and corn. Representations of witches in 16th century German art portray them as independent, meeting in a group and often naked, calling attention to their existence apart from men, their communal activities, and their lustful behavior. Some scenes suggest masturbation and erotic ecstasy. Such representations seem to speak to male fear of female sexuality, especially sexuality not controlled by men. As European expressions overseas, as European expansion overseas in the 15th and 16th century took Christianity to new lands, European conceptions of witchcraft merged with indigenous tradition. In Brazil, for example, native and African practices of magic and witchcraft confronted the importation of the Inquisition, eliciting from those accused of witchcraft confession of sexual deviance, sometimes sex between women. In 1591, a 40-year-old woman, Paula Sequeira, confessed both to the same-sex acts and to sorcery involving uttering the words of consecration used by priests during the sacrament of communion during sex with her husband. This practice, confessed by others as well, was supposedly designed to tame a man and make him mad with love and lust and desire. Although the witch hunters' depiction of witchcraft are, like the reports of the activities of heretical sects, fantastic, both some scholars and contemporary followers of the religious traditions known as Wicca argue that witchcraft was real and a pre-Christian pagan religion, known as the Old Religion, involving magic, healing, and worship of more than one god, including the Great Mother Goddess. It also involved openness to love and desire between women. In the Orthodox Church in medieval Eastern Europe, female same-sex sexuality was considered a sign of paganism. Women who had sex with other women were known as God-insulting grannies, a phrase also used for pagan women and their sexual acts, churchmen thought, involving praying the vili, female spirits. According to those who believed in the reality of the practice of paganism and witchcraft in medieval Europe, Christians and secular authorities came to view such worship, which had sexual aspects, as a pact with the devil, and through torture, the authorities extorted the confessions they sought. Other scholars deny the existence of any kind of organized witch cult or pagan religious tradition, depicting those accused of witchcraft as individual women identified as deviant because they were old, eccentric, isolated, troublesome, and or promiscuous, or because they desired women. Radical feminist scholars in the 1970s wrote about the witch craze as emblematic of a system of control and abuse of women. In Women Hating, Andrea Dworkin connects the practice of witchcraft in early modern Europe to worship of the old religion, healing, and sexual independence, calling the frenzied torture and burning of witches a prime example of women hating. Self-proclaimed revolting hag Mary Daly in Gynecology recounts the witch craze as one manifestation of what she calls the pseudo-ritual syndrome. The Sado-ritual syndrome, and the reenactment of goddess murder. Both scholars see the witch hunts as a form of what Daly calls gynocide, systematic murder of women, and the witch as an example of an independent woman in control of her body and sexuality, an exemplar of the modern-day lesbian feminist. The contemporary practitioners of Wicca and neo-paganism, especially those who embrace feminism, make connections to the history of goddess worship, the Amazons, and early modern witches as healers and sexually independent women. As with mystics and heretics, most of what we know about witches as potential lovers of women must be read between the lines. So once again, fiction comes in handy as well as a way to imagine the possibilities. The Burning Times, a short story by British feminist novelist Sarah Maitland, is narrated by a woman who grew up in a small village alone with her mother, a skilled lace maker with a mass of tangled curls and a love of singing, laughing, and storytelling. The lace maker, who had come from another village, was not popular because she did not care what the other women thought, and she spurned the men who sought to kiss or marry her. One day, as the girl was turning into a woman, a stranger named Margaret showed up at their door. The mother shrieked and embraced her, and then followed months during which the girl, jealous of her mother's attention to Margaret, but also enamored with Margaret, ached and dozed and giggled and sulked and longed with longings that she had no name for. She was confused. Then one day her mother came home with the news that the Inquisitor was coming, and Margaret announced, "We can go." "Not again," said the girl's mother. The Inquisitor arrived, and one of them preached a sermon about hell and witchcraft, begging the community to give up its witches. Afterward, the girl danced around a bonfire with the other young people, But then she noticed no one would speak to her. The people she had grown up with were moving away from her. She ran home in fear, and there she found Margaret and her mother in bed, naked. Their legs, bodies, arms, faces were entangled with each other in movement, intense and intensely beautiful. When I saw Margaret's buttocks in the light from the doorway, saw them lift and plunge, I saw my mother's strong, small butterfly hand reach across them, spread out, holding her. Then I knew that what I had longed for. When I heard my mother moan softly, I knew that what I had wanted. I wanted to touch Margaret like that. I wanted to moan like that. Filled with desire and with jealousy and rage, she crept away, and they, wrapped in their own beauty and passion, did not even hear her coming and going. She ran to the priest and denounced her mother as a witch. Margaret fled in time, but the authorities tortured and raped the mother until she confessed to her all their fantasies of flying, sex with the devil, and spells to cause men impotence. But the one thing she would not do was denounce her daughter. When they burned her at the stake, the parish priest urged the daughter to dance around the fire, lest she burn too, and her mother smiled down at her as the flames consumed her. The story begins with the agonies of the now grown and married daughter, and the mother of the three sons who escaped from her house full of men to the peace of the church, where she allows herself to suffer but also remember her mother's smile and forgiveness. And in the end, playing on Paul's advice to the Corinthians that refraining from sex is best, but marriage will do for those who cannot contain their lust, with they say it is better to marry than to burn, but only just, I think, only just. Whether or not witchcraft and heresy were in fact accusations flung at women who desired other women, unrestrained sexuality and independence from male control played a central role in what the men feared about witches. Okay, there's another subsection, but I have to feed my cat because she's getting annoying. We'll be right back. I know Hildegard. She's like the earliest female composer that we have record of. Her music is like legit. You guys should look her up. I'm going to check how many pages there's left in this chapter. Oh, okay. There's like 8 more pages. It's like 20 minutes? No, 40 minutes? I can't know. At one point I was keeping track of how fast I was reading, but I don't know anymore. Okay. Caught at the act. As the historical story of Bernadette and Bartolomea and the fictional tale by Sarah Maitland suggest, one of the places we can find evidence of love and desire between women is in the records of women caught in the act, few as they are. And we have already seen in the ancient Mediterranean world exactly what women might do with one another was always a little unclear to the male authorities, thereby making female same-sex acts hard to outlaw. Hence the confusion. Biblical calls for death penances not so severe. A French compilation from 1270 stipulates punishments for women as well as men. Men who commit sodomy would the first time lose their testicles, the second time lose their member, and the third time be burned. In a puzzling parallel, a woman who does this shall lose her member each time, and on the third time be burned. What exactly a woman would lose is unclear, as is the offense for which she would be punished. In general, medieval European approaches assumed that a penis substitute was essential to anything that would count as sex. So a great deal of sexual activity between women may have gone unnoticed, and even if discovered, may have gone unpunished, or may not have been punished severely. 14th century Italian scholars, commenting on Roman law, focused on women who exercised their lust on other women and pursued them like men, and of one woman by another, defilement by one woman by another. Throughout Western Europe, by the beginning of the 14th century, the death penalty became the norm for women convicted of what was generally considered sodomy, calling usually for burning at the stake, the same penalty as for heresy. In 1565, French jurist Jean Papin ruled that two women corrupting one another together without a male are punishable unto death. In the Orthodox Church, where sex between women was mostly considered a form of masturbation, with relatively light punishment, women who had sex with one another astride the other were sentenced to flogging. So it is not that sex between women was unknown or ignored, yet we have few records of women prosecuted for their crimes. What cases there are give us some glimpse into the love and desire between women. In 1405, a 16-year-old married woman named Lawrence appealed to the King of France for her part in sexual activities with another married woman, Jeanne. The two worked in the fields together, and one day Jeanne said to Lawrence, "If you will be my sweetheart, I will do you much good." Lawrence saw nothing evil in this proposition. Remember, this account is her request for a pardon, but found herself surprised when Jeanne threw her into a haystack and climbed on her as a man does on a woman, and began to move her hips and do as a man does to a woman. Apparently, Lawrence enjoyed herself enough to have sex several more times in her home, in the vineyards, and even in the village fountain. The case may have come to light because Lawrence eventually tried to break things off, causing Jeanne to attack her with a knife. Lawrence ended up in prison. We do not know what happened to Jeanne, but one release after 6 months, having expressed regret for her sin and depicted Jeanne as the aggressor. In another case, in the early 16th century, a German domestic servant named Greta loved young daughters, went after them, and she also used all the bearings and manners as if she had a masculine effect. Greta was neither hermaphrodite, what we would call now intersex, the authorities checked, nor a wielder of a penis substitute, and perhaps as a result she did not arouse suspicion, serious concern. The chronicler who reported on Greta noted that among the lean, learned, and well-read, one finds this thing is often encountered among the Greeks and Romans. What happened when a dildo came into the practice is clear from a number of the cases. In 1477, a woman named Katharina Herzeldorfer was tried for a crime without a name in the German city of Speyer and subsequently drowned in the Rhine. Herzeldorfer, who had moved to the city 2 years before the trial, was a woman who at first described as with a woman who was at first described as her sister, admitted in the course of the trial of having deflowered her and made love to her during 2 years, and also to having made sexual advances to other women in the city. Witnesses, including two who confessed to having been seduced by Helsendorfer, described her as manlike in appearance and behavior. She gave one woman a substantial sum of money to make her submit to her manly will. Yet she had not passed as a man, despite telling at least a few people that she was a husband to her companion, and according to one witness, hugging and kissing exactly like a man with a woman. Her crime was fashioning an instrument with a red piece of leather at the front, filled with cotton and a wooden stick stuck into it, a tool one seduced women described as a huge thing, as big as half an arm, semen so much that is beyond measure that one could grab with with a full hand. This, unlike rubbing, was serious. Helsendorfer's sister appears nowhere in the trial transcript, so she must have gotten away. The two women who testified about having been seduced were banished from the city, a rather mild punishment. As we shall see, other women who crossed the gender lines and presented themselves as men married women and fashion tools of the trade, also suffered execution in early modern Europe. The fact that Helsendorfer's crime was nowhere named recalls the trial of a woman in Geneva in 1568, also sentenced to drowning for confession to having had sex with another woman. At her execution, her crime was publicly proclaimed as a detestable and unnatural crime which is so ugly that from honor it is not named here. Could female sodomy not have not be named because it was so unimaginable, so threatening, because women so naturally lustful might get ideas? In other traditions as well, women who desire other women could only be conceptualized as like men. A medieval Arabic astrological treatise reported that the stars in masculine signs could make women virile, so they could act as if their female friends were their wives. A 12th century text described masculine women. They also like being the active partner. When her desire is aroused, she does not shrink from seduction. When she has no desire, then she is not ready for sexual intercourse. This places her in a delicate situation with regard to the desires of men and leads her to Sapphism. We have already met Shihab al-Din Ahmed al-Tifashi, the 13th century Arabic writer who addressed tribadism. He reported that tribads love one another as men do, and that they spend a great deal of money on one another, like a man spends on his female beloved. Furthermore, he envisaged the female love on top of her beloved in their lovemaking, unless the lover was thin and the beloved heavy. An earlier Arabic text gave a recipe for drugs which make women detest lesbianism. Again, surely not the exact word used, even if they madly lust for it. And others that make lesbians so desirable to women that they would keep busy with it and passionately lust for it, forgetting all about their work. It was not only legal authorities who had trouble conceptualizing sex between women as anything other than heterosexual in form. Andreas Capellanus, author of the 12th century treatise on love, written at the court of Marie de Champagne, herself associated with the Cathar heresy, put it this way: the main point to be noted about love is that it can exist only between persons of different sex. Between two males or between two females, it can claim no place. For two persons of the same sex are in no way fitted to reciprocate each other's love or to practice its natural acts. The only known medieval text in French to depict sex between women, the 12th century Livre de Manière by Etienne de Fougères, mock and criticize the misbehavior of different social groups, ending with elite women who sin in various ways. Sex between women, what the author calls the vile sin, he depicts as both copying heterosexuality and failing to amount to much because of the lack of a penis. They bang coffin against coffin, without a poker to stir up the fire. They join shield to shield without a lance. They don't bother with a pestle in their mortar. They play the game of thigh fencing, yet they are all from the same mold. One lies still and the other grinds away. One plays the cock and the other the hen, and each one plays her role. What is striking about the stanzas on lovemaking between women in this poem is the military image of shields, fencing, and jousting. In twos, they do their low-life jousting. For these are not images that appear elsewhere in medieval French literature. They were, however, common in Arabic erotic texts, in which Etienne would probably have been familiar, given Arab rule of Spain from the 8th to 15th century. The 12th century Encyclopedia of Pleasure by Abdul Hassan Ali ibn Nazar al-Khatib includes the sentence, "Your vulva became like a shield." In the 11th century work called the Book of Metonymic Expressions, the Iraqi religious judge described sex between women as a war in which there is no spear thrusting, but only fencing off a shield with a shield. A 13th century text by al-Tifashi, The Delight of Hearts, written by after Etienne's poem, described a tournament in which there is no use of a lance, hitting only with great noise, one shield against the other. Altifashi went on to provide an extraordinary detailed description of how two women might joust without a lance. The one that must stay underneath lies on her back, stretched out one leg and bends the other well slightly to one side, therefore offering her opening vagina wide open. Meanwhile, the other lodges her bent leg in her groin, puts the lips of her vagina between the lips that are offered for her, and begins to rub the vagina of her companion in an up and down and up movements that jerk the whole body. The military imagery suggests not only the influence of Arabic texts on Etienne's poems, but also the more open and sophisticated understanding of sex between women in the medieval Arabic tradition compared to the European tradition. What the laws against sex between women, the trials of women caught in the act, and the literary descriptions of sexual encounters tell us is how confounding sexual encounters between women could be, and that a central role of female masculinity played in the conceptions of women's relationships. But what of love between women? Court cases, erotic manuals, penances handed out to nuns, and the fervent imaginings of the copulations of co-wives or heretics or witches all tell us that sexual acts in such a way that love must be read between the lines, if it is visible at all. But words of love from women are rare. Women mystics poured out words of homoerotic love. The unnamed Bavarian nun expressed her love and longing for her friend. Hedwig and Hildegard of Bingen singled out Sarah and Regardis, respectively, a palpably emotional terms, and fiction tells of passion between nuns and secular women who burned for their purported crimes. But let us return to the lone example in European medieval literature that expresses a woman's love for another woman. The one John Boswell mentioned but brushed aside. Beatrice de Romans was a woman troubadour who addressed a poem in courtly love style to a woman named Maria. Nothing is known about either woman. Not surprisingly, some scholars doubt that it is really a love poem from one woman to another. Either Beatrice must really have been a man, or Maria represents the Virgin Mary. Listen to the words of the first two stanzas coming to us from the early 13th century. Lady Maria, if you merit and distinction, joy, intelligence. Oh, okay, let me start again. I already messed up. Lady Maria, in you merit and distinction, joy, intelligence, and perfect beauty, hospitality and honor and distinction, your noble speech and pleasing company, your sweet face and merry disposition, the sweet look and the loving expression that exist in you without pretension, cause me to turn toward you with a pure heart. Thus I pray you, if it please you that true love and celebration and sweet humility should bring me such relief with you, if it please you, lovely woman, then give me that which most hope and joy promises, for in you lie my desire and my heart, and from you stems all happiness, and because of you I'm often sighing. And let us consider one more example of love, one that bridges the medieval world of the convent and the new possibilities that emerge as the world opened up. Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a 17th century Mexican nun, was a self-taught poet, playwright, and a scholar whose accomplishments shocked her male contemporaries. Among other things, she wrote love poems for the wife of the viceroy, and thus has come down to us as a Chicana feminist and lesbian precursor. She left these lines: "Don't go, my darling. I don't want this to end yet. This sweet fiction is all I have. Hold me so I'll die happy, thankful for your lies. My breast answer yours, magnet to magnet. Why make love to me, then leave? Why mock me? Don't brag about your conquest. I'm not your trophy. Go ahead, reject these arms that wrap you in sumptuous silk. Try to escape my arms, my breasts. I'll keep you prisoner in my poem." Juxtaposing words of love and evidence of women caught in the act with the contradictory religious and secular pronouncements suggesting how cautiously we must evaluate the evidence. Suggests how cautiously we must evaluate the evidence. Love between women was not unknown, and in some societies it was deemed harmless or even desirable for women who lived in polygynous households. The religious institutions, especially Christian ones, that sought to prescribed love between women, in fact, facilitated it and provided forms of expression for passionate homoeroticism. In these different sex segregated spaces, erotic friendships could blossom. In the eyes of the male authorities, female same sex sexuality was at times inconsequential, at times unimaginable, and at times threatening. As in ancient worlds, what separated acceptable forms of same sex sexuality from those considered so abhorrent that the acts could not even be named was primarily masculinity. In the cases we have seen here, women who penetrated other women, and independence from male control. Women such as Katharina Helldorfer, witches with insatiable lust, and these were the monsters greatly to be feared. We turn now to consider more closely diverse manifestations of female masculinity in a wider variety of societies. Chapter 5, In Plain Sight, 1100 to 1900. Okay, this is where I'm stopping for tonight because I've read a lot and I feel like I'm messing up more. Okay. So I'm going to end this live stream and then start another live stream if there's anybody who wants to stick around and talk, because I felt weird about having that all connected last time. Okay. So thanks for tuning in. Bye.